From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The latest inflation report shows consumer prices up 7.1% year over year as the one-time cryptocurrency king Sam Bankman-Fried is arrested in the Bahamas. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Joe Sternberg and Kim Strassel. Welcome to you both. The Labor Department on Tuesday released its newest inflation report. Prices are up 7.1% in November compared with 1 year ago. And Joe, one of the things that strikes me here is the framing effect of this. I mean, it's true that that is down from 7.7% year over year in October and 9.1% in the peak of June. And yet it is still amazing to see some of the news coverage saying inflation is down sharply to 7%. And so you're an experienced Fed head with apologies to Grateful Dead fans. So what do you read into these numbers today?
Well, I think we're probably getting into what I would think of as the defining deviancy down phase of this inflationary cycle for precisely the reason that you just alluded to, Kyle. 7.1% inflation is high inflation. Remember, the Federal Reserve's target is 2%. So we are well above that 2% target. And in fact, the inflation has been substantially above the Fed's target for about a year now, I think, if you were to go back and look at the data, perhaps rather more than that. And yet we have this celebration that it is less abnormally high than it used to be, even though it's still very abnormally high. A certain amount of that celebration, particularly among investors on Wall Street, is related to the fact that the Fed's method of fighting inflation this year has been to increase interest rates, to engage in quantitative tightening, to reduce its balance sheet. That has all been very painful for investors. And so they are anxiously keeping their eyes open for any sign that the pain is going to let up soon. And so I think we're coming to have this tendency to focus on inflation data that is still bad, but is at least better than it used to be. And I mean, the fact that it's better than it used to be might be a sign that what the Fed has been doing over this course of this year is starting to have an effect, that we're starting to see some moderating in the rate of increase in prices. But the Fed is still very far away from achieving its 2% target. And workers are still finding that as a result of that being far behind, their real inflation-adjusted pay continues to fall behind the inflation. So I think that we are very much not out of the woods yet.
It does seem to me also like the Fed has been playing a game of whack-a-mole here a little bit as inflation spreads out, though, through the economy. So if you look deep down into the inflation report today from the Labor Department, the main thing that was down in November was energy prices. And we know those year-over-year numbers can have a lag, taking into account what happened a year ago. So I like to look at these monthly numbers, and they're not great. I mean, food at home is up 0.5 percentage point in November alone. Food away from home, the same, 0.5 percentage point. Core inflation, so-called, less food and energy, because those are more volatile. So economists look at core inflation to get a better sense of the broader trends, is up 0.2. And shelter, Kim, is up 0.6 percentage point. And again, that is just in November alone. And so it seems like the inflation is everywhere. And I guess that's been the story now for some months, but that's what strikes me looking at these figures.
Yeah, that was my takeaway as well, too, that when you look at the core numbers, and then if you look at the month-to-month numbers, inflation is still going up. It's not going up dramatically, but it certainly is not an indication that it is falling. And two, often people do look at those core numbers because, as we talk about, food and energy can be more volatile. And those core numbers year over year were about 6%, which is holding pretty steady in recent months. It was 6.6% in September, 6.3% in October. So coming down a little bit, but again, in certain areas, increasing month to month rather than over the yearly figure. As you say, there are some anomalies there. So if I were the Fed, and I agree with Joe, I think that some of this framing is about pressuring the Fed not to go as steep when it meets next time, maybe instead of 75 basis points, only 50. I mean, by the way, isn't it remarkable that this is what we're now talking about is not whether or not the Fed is going to increase, but just how large it will be. So I think that's a bit of a campaign there. But if I were the Fed and I were Jerome Powell and I were looking at all of this, I would not see anything at the moment that made me feel particularly good that the Fed is gaining on this problem.
Joe, what's your assessment of that? Where do these numbers leave the Fed as it goes into its new meeting, figuring out how much to raise rates?
So I think the first thing that we need to be really clear on is what we actually mean when we say that the inflation rate is coming down, because that does not mean that the price level is coming down. Remember, the inflation rate is a rate of change. And in particular, it is a rate of increase. So the way to think about this is, you're driving down the highway 65 miles an hour, and then you need to slow to 55 miles an hour. You're still moving forward, just not quite as rapidly as you were before. And that's basically what's going on with this reduction in the monthly inflation report. It does not mean that prices are actually falling. So part of the dilemma that is facing not just the Fed, but any economic policymaker in the government, including in Congress and the Biden administration, is that you have this problem where although prices are increasing less rapidly than they were before, they are still increasing rapidly. Real inflation-adjusted wages are not keeping up with that. And I think that what's going to happen is that the Fed believes that what they need to do is really tamp down on economic activity in order to get inflation under control. And so I think that they will continue on the rate increase path that they are on. I think Chairman Jerome Powell has been trying to make it pretty clear that he now views fighting inflation as job number one, to the exclusion of any other task that the Fed might ordinarily think that it had. Although they might be tempted to slow the pace of those increases a little bit, maybe do 0.5 percentage point increase at the meeting that wraps up on Wednesday this week, as opposed to the 0.75 percentage point increase that they've been doing for many of their meetings this year. But I think still the bias is going to be in favor of continuing to increase rates until they get substantial evidence that they really do have inflation under control, because what Powell seems to really want to avoid is a situation like we saw during the 70s, where there might be some sign that the rate of inflation is slowing toward the Fed's target. And so the Fed eases up on the brakes a little bit, but then the inflation continues to increase again. So the Fed needs to reapply the brakes. They want to avoid that kind of start-stop that was such a problem for them in the 70s.
Joe mentioned wages, and here's the figures from the Labor Department on Tuesday. Real average hourly earnings decreased 1.9% seasonally adjusted from November 2021 to November 2022. The change in real average hourly earnings, combined with a decrease of 1.1% in the average work week, resulted in a 3% decrease in real average weekly earnings. And so that is the inflation tax. And Kim, I suppose that figures like that are one argument against the idea that these inflation expectations are getting embedded in the economy, and that will make it harder for the Fed to ultimately break the back of this. On the other hand, as workers negotiate for wages, there have been some pretty striking numbers in recent days. This is a headline from a couple weeks ago from CNBC. Delta pilots would get more than 30% in pay raises under new contract deal. And I believe this is a 4-year contract they're talking about. So 30% over 4 years. I mean, does that suggest, Kim, to you that despite the fact that inflation is still running faster than wage increases, the wage increases are well above the Fed's target and are going to make this a harder thing for them to handle?
Right. That's exactly what I was going to say, is that when we talk about wages declining, you have to put that and measure it against the overall inflation number. It still means that workers are getting more in pay. Otherwise, that decline would be even huger given the rate of inflation. So 3% versus the 7% inflation rate we're talking about. And what is driving that is these demands from workers for much bigger payouts. And that, of course, gets to the fear of a wage price spiral, this phenomenon in which wage increases cause price increases, which in turn cause wage increases. And it's this negative feedback loop, as it were. I think there's certainly some indication indication that we are there. And it's also one of the reasons why the longer this goes on, the harder it also becomes to deal with it. And that's why the Fed, I think, is still, when you hear them talk, they've remained pretty bullish. And I think that Jerome Powell, after messing around for far too long last year, has potentially come to realize the size of the problem here by looking at both the inflation numbers and also the wage situation, and understands that it's going to have a lot more pain out there before things get back under control, unfortunately.
Joe, what's your read of this expectations question? And the other point that hits me about this Delta contract is, again, it's a 4-year contract. And so this is not like an annual raise that is high historically, but compared to today's inflation makes some sense. This is a contract that is going to last through, I don't know, 2026. And that means a real overhang for contracts like this when President Biden is hoping that the inflation will go back down.
So I will say at the outset that I have some heterodox views on this issue of inflation expectations. So listeners out there who object to this, go ahead, send us cards, letters, postcards telling me how wrong I am.
Yeah, only
about
send
this.
them to Joe. Yeah, just send them to Joe.
But that out of the way, my sense of what's going on right now is that in this inflationary cycle, it really started in 2020, 2021, with a lot of companies realizing, perhaps to their surprise, that they had the scope to start increasing prices and that consumers would bear that, and that consumers would bear that because there was so much easy money in the economy, so much of it had gotten channeled into people's bank accounts via so much of this COVID aid and the checks that Treasury kept depositing directly into our bank accounts and all of the rest of it. So that gave companies in that period sort of this earnings boost they hadn't necessarily expected and hadn't really earned, in the sense of, investing to boost their productivity over time. And now workers writ large are kind of waddling in to try to divvy up their share of that again. And so I think you look at some of these union negotiations like the pilots, and you have to understand that kind of labor negotiation against a background of fares already increasing, because as a result of pilot shortage and the disruptions of COVID, airlines are cutting back their schedules and discovering that that leaves them with the scope to charge more to passengers for the amount of flights that the airlines are operating. And so I think that actually that's the kind of cycle that we need to be thinking about here and worrying about, because I do think that there is a bit of a danger from the perspective of the broader economy that the Fed kind of gets this the wrong way around. And what you actually do need to do is come up with ways of getting some of that excess money out of the economy while making sure that the conditions are still there for productive investment that allows people to increase their real pay. Because otherwise, you're going to end up in a situation like the UK has had for long periods since 2008, where inflation was allowed to run in an uncontrolled fashion and wages never actually caught up to that. And people saw sustained deterioration in their quality of life. And I think that that is a danger here that the Fed needs to be thinking about. And is actually a good reason for them to be so focused on trying to get inflation under control.